Hello.
Hola.
Bonjour.
Привет. 你好. Hello and welcome to Language with Chu. Today's video is about undemocratic speech, or the speech that is used by our dear politicians to brainwash us or talk to us, if you prefer. I found a paper from 1992, so it's quite old, more than 30 years old. It's by John Gastil. I don't know if you can see here. And I liked it because, well, the examples are outdated now, and I apologize in advance if my examples are not the best, because I'm sure you'll come up with better ones. I just draw a blank whenever I have to quote a politician or something. But I found it interesting because he breaks it down into different categories. We all know that the media, the government, etc., have a certain way of convincing us of certain things. I'll try to stay... to stay a little neutral so that I don't get banned or this video doesn't get deleted. But as you know, there's programming techniques or propaganda, if you wish. But which ones are they? Like, you know intuitively that sometimes you're lied to, but could you list, say, 3 ways in which they do that? Other than just saying, well, they lie all the time, which some people do and say. Or other than saying, well, maybe they use... fear or something like that. Well, there's actually linguistic techniques, if you wish, to convey certain messages that tend to convince people more of a certain thing, or that tend to convince people that they want to comply with certain measures, etc. So I'll just list them, and then hopefully you'll give me better examples. Let's start with vocabulary, okay? Number 1 is word removal. The author says that it's a bit like in Orwell's books, 1984 being one example, but he also wrote some papers about political discourse, and basically he took it to the extreme, saying that if you don't have a word for something, you'll prevent people from thinking about something. Well, we all know that sometimes you don't have a word, but you can still think about something, so that was the extreme of propaganda in his book, which was fictional. But the author here, he points out that word removal is a fact when it comes to political speeches. For example, in the 80s, Democrats stopped using the word liberal. They just wouldn't use that word. And nowadays, maybe a more modern example would be how little politicians will appeal to God or spiritual endeavors, etc., to convince people about something, any measure that they want to install, etc. Like I said, you probably have a better example of words that have disappeared. Number 2 is new terms. And in the 80s, remember he's giving examples that are quite old. There was a word that was coined, it was nuke speak, like newspeak from Orwell. And it was referring to anything that had to do with nuclear war, nuclear weapons, etc., the pros and the cons. Today, there's also a term called greenwashing, which is to make fun a little bit of brainwashing and the green agenda and how they basically code everything in green terms to push a certain agenda. But then you could also say that there are other new terms like woke or toxic masculinity. And before, those words weren't really used, or not with the same sense, the same loaded sense that they have today. So you see that depending on the reality of the society and the agenda of the politicians, you'll add new words to convey a meaning that it may be stronger than what you would convey without it. Then you have over-lexicalization. That's number 3. And that one is interesting because he explains that a lot of the times in political speeches, people will use synonyms to give the impression that the speech is very rich and that there's subtleties and confuse the person listening, etc. But actually it means the same, or almost. All the words mean the same. But by vocabulary, the amount thereof could be a sign of what preoccupies society at a certain point in history and in each party. So, for example, the conservatives will only talk, or used to talk, only about feminism, while the left would talk about bourgeois, liberal, socialist, radical feminism, etc. So they would expand one concept into many to either attribute more importance to the concept or make distinctions that for normal people are not really that necessary. Then linked to that one is number 4 is technical words. And It includes acronyms and technical terms. I think that's one of the most important ones because it adds vagueness and it adds a sense of importance to the speakers, because the layperson may not understand exactly where they're trying to get to or get at, or the subtle meaning of certain expressions. For an acronym, you have LGBTQS2. I can't keep track of it because it keeps changing, and most people won't know what each of those letters mean. Other technical words could be, just from the top of my head, maybe mRNA thing, as you're supposed to say now, because nobody really knows genetics and stuff, so they could just as easily have called it genic therapy or genetic tweaking. And but no, they have a technical terms to sound more scientific. Then for synonyms, you have in the greenwashing movement, you have green, sustainable, environmentally friendly, clean, and they're all more or less the same. And when you ask for specifics, it's just words that fit into a certain context and makes you look like you're complying with certain measures, or like you're morally better than other people, etc. Okay, number 5, imprecise words. Those would comprise anything that is too vague to define. Like, can you define in just a few words democracy? Can you define freedom easily? And freedom is a big one because politicians can use it to mean a completely different thing, and you're not aware of it. You just put words into their mouths, or you fill in the blanks, rather. So it makes you agree, more likely to agree. It makes unpleasant facts easier to hide. For example, when America exports freedom abroad, but they don't tell you all the details of what they do abroad and the results of their freedom export, you're left to ignore it, to forgive it, to come up with a narrative that makes it more digestible. And two main things about this is that one is you have plausible deniability later. As a politician, as a leader, as a policymaker, you can always say, well, I never meant X or Y, I meant Z. And nobody can say that that's not true, because the terms are so vague that a person can hide behind the true meaning of what they actually intended, because the word is just a label that it was so too vague to have any weight to begin with. And then I think Chomsky said this also, as you repeat these words more and more, you manage to anesthetize a population, because people become less and less critical. They just think, well, if they use this word so much, it must mean what I think it means, or it must be good. So it makes you more receptive to them. So that's it for words. And please share if you have any better words than the ones I just gave. Oh, sorry, I forgot one. Euphemisms. Euphemisms disguise meaning. So they're not so much ambiguous like the previous ones as they are misleading. Here I can think of many examples, actually. There's collateral damage, which actually means people dying. But when you talk about collateral damage, and they used to do it a lot during the war in Iraq, for example, it sugarcoats the whole reality. The author gives the example of pacification in Vietnam, which was actually the removal of villagers and the destruction of a village. But when you hear pacification, you don't really know the details, so it confuses the person listening and possibly makes them more prone to accepting, say, sending more funds towards war, etc. Then there was another example of the Turkish invasion in Cyprus, where Turkey made a request to the UN saying we shouldn't call it looting for taking the nation's property, but we should say that property is being confiscated, taken for storage, or being accounted for. So you see how much more digestible that is than just basically stealing. Then I think there are several modern ones like gender reassignment, which amounts to genital mutilation, and is much less possible to pass a legislation if you say it's going to be about genital mutilation than if you say it's just gender reassignment, because gender is fluid and subjective, etc. And then there's others. There's like rendition for sending prisoners to Guantanamo, for example, or stress position for torture, etc. You can think of many probably. Those are euphemisms. And then finally, there are loaded words which add meaning and connotations. So it's not the same to talk about poor people and destitute people. Destitute gives you the idea that it's more urgent. Then the loaded words can also frame a debate. For example, it's not the same to talk about a fetus, an unborn child, the product of conception, or a baby. those have different connotations, and depending on what words you use, the speaker will be geared towards a certain meaning. And then there's others, like pandemic, for example. We all saw that word thousands of times in 2020, and it wasn't really a pandemic. The numbers don't add up to be called a pandemic, but they just use that loaded word because that's scary. And then there's others, white supremacy, toxic masculinity again, political assassin versus martyr, depending on which country you're talking about or which leader is talking about them. They'll use one or the other term. Another more recent one, rather recent, is annexing Crimea. When you talk about annexing, it's a military term, so it implies violence. And in the case of Crimea, it wasn't. It was a democratic vote, a referendum. So you see how it's framed so that you believe certain actions not done by the West are bad. So that's it for vocabulary. Then grammar. First, there's speech acts. Speech acts are things that are actions that you commit through language. So, for example, a priest declaring somebody married, it's a speech act when he says, "I now declare you husband and wife," for example. That's a speech act. And usually in government, the institution that is responsible for saying something automatically gets authority by saying it, so you assume that it's an order. Recently, there's been the case of the FDI being on a lawsuit with certain doctors because the doctors were suspended for recommending ivermectin to people during COVID. And the FDI was clearly saying, stop taking horse medication, they called it, even though it was approved by the FDA, and even though they didn't really have any authority over doctors. But the result was that what they said counted as an order, and many people took that seriously. So that's one case where what it imposed a certain measure or decision, etc. And then there's, the speech acts can be disguised orders. So a vaccine recommendation became a mandate, really, but in many cases it was just recommended, or it was almost enforced, but you still had the choice not to do it. And the problem was the consequences. Like if you get fired for not doing something, it's still a very strong act, a very strong measure by the authorities. It's not just a recommendation or a suggestion. So the suggestions very easily can become orders or be perceived as orders, while in fact there's no legislation to back them up. Okay, then the next one, number 9, is implicature. And that's a very famous one, but it's more technical, I'd say. So it's just another way of distracting listeners because they require more effort. You're implying things without saying them, basically. There's also plausible deniability again, because there's different possible interpretations. And they're accepted at a more subconscious level. So, for example, if you say, who wouldn't want to save the elderly? Obviously, everybody does, right? Nobody wants to harm their grandma or grandpa. So by asking a question like that, or by inserting those little comments that have like a moral tone to them into your speech, you're going to make people more prone to accepting something than if you just stuck to the facts. Then you see it more and more in companies where, like, okay, we promote fair trade and blah blah blah, all economic terms, and then in the middle they insert an inclusivity. And it doesn't really fit the context, but because you may be already leaning towards accepting the company's policy, for example, you let that one slide, even though you know that it could be a political move, a political measure, that it could mean restrictions for you, etc. Or like if you talk about somebody's regime, more recently Putin, you automatically assume that regime is loaded. It's not a democracy, it's not a government. So you're going to be leaning towards a certain opinion or view of a certain political character that doesn't fit into the general understood agenda or understood view of the world, just because they use those words. So it's implied. Or if you say, another one would be, we don't want another Munich or another war, just another war. So you must comply with this and this and this. You must send taxpayer money to this country because we don't want to reach the point where we have another Second World War. Except that the two don't necessarily go together. Maybe if you don't send support to this country that is not fighting fairly, for example, you're not going to have Second World War again. So be careful with those, because those are the most insidious ones, I think. Or when somebody says, well, I don't know, Putin again, he's the worst person since Goebbels. And then you can ask the politician later, but wait, you meant that he's a Nazi, right? You meant that he's evil. And the politician can say, no, I just meant, since the time of Goebbels. So there's always the plausible deniability while they make you buy a whole load of propaganda. And then with implicature too, you have misleading answers. So the author gives a good example that I think it applies to ISIS and Al-Qaeda later. Somebody asked a politician, why are you funding the Contras, but you bomb Libya? Which ones are the terrorists here? And the answer was, well, the Contras don't commit terrorism abroad. And you're left with like, yeah, but you're still funding terrorism and then claiming that you're fighting it somewhere else. And the same with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I think. It's a double standard, and on the one hand, you want to bring democracy somewhere while you're actually funding the people who prevent peace from happening. So that's better analyzed by people who are interested in politics at a deeper level, but you can see through the surface pretty easily on that one. Okay, then for grammar as well, there's syntax. So if I use very, very complex sentences, it makes the listener believe that I have more authority. Or if you're a bit confusing in your sentence structure and stuff. And, for example, Obama was reputed for using more complex language than, say, George W. Bush. And Bush was actually or nowadays Biden, because he probably can't speak with complex sentences. But whether it's more complex and it adds a sense of authority, or less complex and you confuse the listeners to the point where they have to fill in the blanks, or else they think like, who am I being led by? Who is my president here? He can't string 3 words together. That would be more like Biden. Okay, then there's little tricks in syntax. For example, when you use the passive tense or when you use nominalization. I can never say that word. So, for example, if I say, I will penalize you if you do not observe these regulations, that's an agent. I will penalize you. Then you change it to, if you do not observe these regulations, I will penalize you. That puts the agent a little further away. You're responsible if you do not obey. Third, if you do not observe these regulations, you will be penalized. And you can leave out the agent altogether. By whom? I don't know. I'll just be punished. And then the fourth one that you see very often is failure of observance of these regulations will result in penalties. So that one makes it look like it's a real law, and it removes the agent altogether. So you can watch for those signs, because sometimes just changing the sentence structure can give a sentence a lot more meaning and a lot more weight than it deserves. And then there's others, like, for example, negation. It's true that blah, 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 but... And because the person said it's true, you think that they're being reasonable, but actually after the but, they change the meaning completely, or they say the opposite. Then there's contrastive pairs. So that's, for once, this is a good example. It was Kennedy, JFK, who said it, and it says, and it's when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. So those pairs, those are very much used in politics, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. Then there's 3-part lists that you see a lot. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence in the US, or liberté, égalité, fraternité in France. Usually those trios, those groups of 3 words have a lot more weight in people's psyches. Even if you don't agree with one, for example, you have to take the whole package. Then depending on the language, you can also have a lot more plays with words. So some languages are more focused on the agent and some on the recipient of the action. So you can play around with those techniques and convey a meaning in a more subtle way, while actually it's an order, for example. And then an easy one is pronouns. I already talked about pronouns on this video, but they can indicate the position you take. So if you refer to the government as it instead of we, you know that there's a distance in the it. Or if they say we versus they, or in languages where there's 2 you pronouns, like Spanish or French, you have a formal you and an informal you. That already sets a distance. The speaker sets the distance, if they're talking to you with a tú, with the informal you, or with the usted, the formal you. And with pronouns, you can also attribute responsibility or remove responsibility from a statement. So if you say, I have found that this measure is wrong, you're taking responsibility. But if you say, we have found, who's we? it could be the whole government, it could be a couple of people, but at least you water down your responsibility. And if you say it has been found, it's even more watered down. By whom? Like, do you even agree with what you're saying, or you're just saying, reporting that it was found to be false, for example? Okay, and then the final, I think, for grammar is naming convention. So he talks about using roles and positions, and he gives a funny example. I didn't take the name, unfortunately, but basically somebody accuses the mayor of a town of doing something, and his representative says it wasn't the mayor of the town, but the secretary of blah, blah, blah who said that. While it happened to be that the mayor of the town was also the secretary of such and such department. So sometimes they can fool you with the titles. And of course, it's not the same to say Mr. Mayor as to saying, hey, Peter. You know, it shows a different degree of authority. Okay, and here's where we get to rhetorical strategies. One is integrative complexity. And that's when people say that people make you believe that the different opinions are accepted, are valid, that several points of view are okay to have, etc. And it's usually complexity in the language. So they say, for example, that if you study speeches on election year, say, and after the election, the ones before the election will be a lot more complex and more worked on and richer than speeches after elections. Or if a war is approaching, it's getting closer, the language is much, much simpler because you need to convince people right now. So all those you can see in context, basically, before an election, after an election, before a war, after a war, etc. Then the next one, number 14, is rituals. And that's, for example, the things that allow for the politician, the representative or whatever, to add more importance to what they're saying. And he quotes, for example, Bush saying, "The Bible on which I placed my hand is the Bible on which Washington placed his." So automatically he's putting himself at Washington's level. I'm legitimate here. I add rapport, I add legitimacy, I add commonality with other leaders, whether I'm the opposite party or not, who cares? So rituals are during ritualistic activities, so like presidential inaugurations, any kind of election and stuff like that. Then there's metaphors. And metaphors are interesting because they're very repeated. They're very often repeated and taken confused with the truth. So I don't know if you noticed, but in the election speeches very often have sports and war metaphors. This state is a battleground, or the battle for Ohio, or he won over this person, or it's almost like that removes the idea of a negotiation or communication and civil discourse and an exchange of opinions, because you're at war. You're two teams fighting for something. And that is just a myth, that it's a metaphor used in politics, but it doesn't need to be like that if they're all aiming at making the country, for example, a better place. And then one of my favorites actually is number 16, is myths. And he explains that, well, first, they're simple and non-falsifiable. Second, it justifies actions and assertions because they're widely held as the truth by the social community, by society. And they're most efficient when evoked indirectly. So, for example, the most clear one to me is like the American dream, or America is the greatest democracy on earth, etc. People don't really question that much, even though nowadays there's little proof that those are the truth, or they may have been in the past, but they're not any longer. When you listen to American people and how they're struggling right now. But all those things around the American dream, united, withstand, etc. So they can tell you, well, we survived as a nation, this, therefore we're ready for the next challenge. Even though they sold you a whole lot of propaganda as to what the next challenge is. Again, refer back to 2020, for example. Then they also make weak arguments appear strong, because if you believe the myth, it's impossible to disprove it, and anything that gets piggybacked on that must be true. And then I think the reason why they work is because they assuage people's fears. It brings a sense of comfort, reassurance, of unity. And they provide a common experience, or the illusion of a common experience. They bolster loyalty, group cohesion, etc. Another one, more modern example, I think, would be freedom of speech. in many cases, that has been very reduced, actually. But because we all have this illusion that there is freedom of speech in the modern world, in the West, etc., we have to kind of make narratives or make excuses for the fact checkers, etc., because otherwise it doesn't jibe with our idea of, or our myth of freedom of speech. The other one could be how science is objective. While we've seen example after example of it not being objective, and in fact it being turning into a dogma in many cases, but because you have this idea that science is at the top of objectivity and rationality, etc., you tend to kind of follow along as long as it's backed by science. So you follow the science. And then there's others like the West versus the East. Usually the West is seen as more advanced than the East. And even though the world is becoming multipolar and things are changing, there's still that image that, you know, the West must stay strong, etc. Instead of, why don't we all just get along and live well together? Anyway, it's not something new. In the times of Darwin, say, for example, people thought, especially the British, thought that anybody, any nation, any group of people that would have invaded native aborigines in many other places were primitive people. They even had them displayed at a zoo, can you imagine? Because the Europeans were an advanced race, according to them. So it's nothing new, but be careful of those myths because you take them as the truth. You don't really question them. Okay, and then finally, conversational tactics. One is just simply turn-taking, how you set the scenario. And there's often an illusion that it's a democracy, for example, when you see political debates, right? But if you pay attention, one side is given a little more time, or it doesn't matter really because it's just a matter of, it's a superficial democracy. Or you could see it a lot in French debates. Where I live in France, you have like senators and deputies yelling at each other and fighting and arguing, etc. And it gives you the impression that it's a fruitful debate, a true democracy. But in fact, they can vote and then they can outrun that vote and cancel the measures, the policies, and get away with doing whatever they want anyway. So that's another little trick. And then finally, agenda setting, and you see it a lot more in weird contexts. So basically you're determining how say a conference or a speech is going to go. First we're going to talk about this and that and da-da-da. And you can see it more in out of context. For example, banks, when like if you're in LinkedIn or whatever, listing the agenda for the day or whatever, and how they add inclusivity and, you know, and the green agenda, etc. Well, they actually don't care. Like, it's a bank, right? Or it's a company that cares about like making millions of dollars. They don't really care about that, but they make it the central focus because it's politically correct, or because they will lose advertisers if they don't, etc. But all that said, really it's about our mental hygiene. And I talked about this in another video that I'll link to up here. It's about our becoming immune to all these little tricks and basically digging a little bit deeper to find the truth so that we don't fall for the immediate narrative. In fact, if most of the media are saying that's the truth, you can be fairly certain that it's not, for example, without being a conspiracy theorist, just because it doesn't make sense many times. And keep in mind that people are very, very easy to manipulate. When it comes to non-verbal programming, for example, they did a study where they had a person describe a politician, or two or three, and they gave them an object. So if the object was heavy, they attributed more importance to that politician than if the object was light. So we're that easily manipulated, basically. Just an object in their hands colored their perception of a certain politician. Okay, but this is getting long. I hope that you like the examples, but please come up with better ones, and that you keep these in mind, because sometimes it can come in handy when you just stop and you're listening to somebody and it's very convincing and you're like, wait a minute, why do I feel uncomfortable about something, about what he just said? Something doesn't make sense. Let me dig deeper. And that's when you see, okay, he's using this myth, or he's using integrative complexity or something. And then you dig a little deeper and you find that he was lying to his teeth. All right, I hope you like this video. See you next time for more language tips and trivia and things about language. And please share and comment and subscribe to my channel. Bye-bye.